I'm a 27-year-old guy, and for as long as I can remember, my family life has revolved around walking on eggshells around my dad. He's the kind of person who always has to be in control, and if things don't go his way, you'd better brace yourself for a guilt trip or a full-blown tantrum. My mom mostly goes along with it, brushing off his behavior to keep the peace. Then there's my younger brother Justin, who's 23 and pretty much the golden child. If there's ever a problem, it's never his fault, and my dad will bend over backward to shield him from any kind of accountability. Growing up, my dad ran the house like a small dictatorship. He had to know where we were, what we were doing, and why we were doing it. If you didn't give him the right answer, he'd launch into this whole speech about how ungrateful we were for everything he did for us. My mom, on the other hand, would tell us to just listen to him, saying he worked hard and didn't mean half the things he said. But when someone says cruel things often enough, it doesn't really matter if they mean it or not. Justin, on the other hand, never seemed to get the same treatment. When he was a teenager, he crashed our dad's car, and instead of getting punished, my dad bought him a newer one a week later. Meanwhile, if I so much as scratched the family car when I was his age, I'd get lectured for hours about responsibility. It was obvious that Justin could do no wrong in our dad's eyes, and over time, I just learned to keep my head down and avoid stirring the pot. But last month, everything came to a head at a family dinner. It was supposed to be a casual evening, a rare chance to catch up since I don't live at home anymore. I'd been looking forward to it, hoping for at least one meal without the usual tension. But my dad seemed to have other plans. As soon as we sat down, he started making little digs about my life. He commented on how I didn't seem to be settling down anytime soon, and how Justin was already making strides toward buying a house with his girlfriend. It wasn't even subtle. I tried brushing it off, focusing on my food, but then he moved on to criticizing my career. I work in tech, which has been great for me, but apparently it's not stable enough for him. He started in on this spiel about how I should have gone into something practical like finance or law, saying I'd never be able to provide for a family this way. Justin just sat there smirking, while my mom gave me that look she always does, the one that says, just let it go. Then, out of nowhere, my dad brought up this vacation the family had supposedly been planning. He talked about how it was going to be this amazing getaway, and how we had all decided it would be great to rent a luxury villa. I had no idea what he was talking about because I'd never agreed to any of it. Before I could say anything, he casually mentioned that I'd be covering the bulk of the cost since I was doing so well in my career. At first, I thought he was joking. When I asked him to clarify, he acted surprised, saying it was already settled and that he'd made the reservations under the assumption that I'd pay. I told him I hadn't agreed to anything like that, and that's when things got ugly. He immediately shifted gears, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful after everything he's done for me. He went on about how he'd sacrificed so much for this family and that it was my turn to contribute. Justin chimed in, saying it wasn't a big deal and that I should just pay since I could afford it. My mom stayed quiet, as usual, staring at her plate like it was the most interesting thing in the world. I tried standing my ground, pointing out that I'd never been asked about the vacation, let alone agreed to it, but it didn't matter. My dad was on a roll, pulling out every manipulation tactic he could think of. He even tried to guilt-trip me by saying I was ruining the vacation for everyone else. By the end of the dinner, I was seething. I left feeling like I'd been backed into a corner, but that night, I realized I'd had enough. This wasn't just about the vacation, it was years of being manipulated and guilt-tripped, of being treated like I owed my dad something just for existing. I started researching emotional manipulation and talking to friends about what had happened, and the more I learned, the more I realized how toxic the whole situation was. Justin, of course, thought I was overreacting when I brought it up later. He told me to stop being dramatic and just go along with it for the sake of the family. My mom echoed the same sentiment, saying I should apologize to my dad to smooth things over. But for the first time, I didn't feel like backing down. I started therapy, and my therapist helped me see how much of my dad's behavior I'd normalized over the years. She encouraged me to set boundaries, even if it meant facing some pushback. A couple of weeks later, another family dinner was planned, and I decided this would be my chance to confront my dad. I was nervous, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change, and I was finally ready to make it happen. Update 1. The dinner started tense right from the moment I walked in. My mom was setting the table while my dad was already seated, scrolling through his phone like he had more important things to do. Justin strolled in a few minutes after me, grinning like this was going to be just another family meal. I had made up my mind on the way there. No more biting my tongue, no more excuses for my dad's behavior. We were barely halfway through dinner when my dad started steering the conversation toward the vacation again. He brought it up casually, talking about how excited we were for this big family trip, like the whole thing hadn't been dropped on me without warning. I didn't let him get far. I asked him directly when I'd ever agreed to pay for the trip, and the room went silent. My dad looked up from his plate, caught off guard. He quickly recovered, waving it off like I must have forgotten our agreement. Justin chimed in, saying it was no big deal and that I should stop making a fuss. I wasn't letting it slide this time. I told him I hadn't agreed to anything and had the receipts to prove it. That's when things started to spiral. My dad leaned back in his chair, his tone shifting to one of those faux calm lectures I'd heard 1,000 times before. He claimed he was only trying to bring the family together and that I was making up stories to avoid pulling my weight. He even said I'd misunderstood him and that I should be more grateful for everything he's done. Justin jumped in, backing him up like always, throwing in something about how I was making this harder than it needed to be. I wasn't backing down. I pulled out my phone and showed the text messages he'd sent me, where he explicitly said I'd be paying for the villa. I watched his face shift from surprise to anger. He accused me of trying to embarrass him in front of the family, saying I was dredging up old issues just to stir the pot. My mom sat frozen, her eyes darting between us like she was praying for the argument to end. At this point, I pointed out how this wasn't the first time he'd used guilt and manipulation to get what he wanted. I brought up specific examples, like how he'd pressured me to take out a loan for Justin's car repairs a few years ago, or the time he made me cancel plans with friends to babysit for Justin because family comes first. My dad denied all of it, calling my examples exaggerated and accusing me of trying to paint him as the bad guy. Then something unexpected happened. My mom, who had been quiet the whole time, spoke up. She said she'd noticed these patterns too, but had always been too afraid to say anything. For a second, I thought things might shift, but that hope didn't last long. My dad turned his frustration toward her, asking why she would betray him like this. Justin cut in, calling me selfish and saying I was trying to break the family apart for attention. I stayed calm, even as things got more heated. I explained that this wasn't about winning or being right, it was about the years of emotional manipulation and the toll it had taken on me. That's when my dad pulled his signature move, the emotional meltdown. He started tearing up, saying he only ever wanted what was best for us, and that he couldn't understand why I was attacking him like this. He claimed my accusations were unfair, and that I'd ruined what was supposed to be a nice family evening. But I wasn't letting him use his tears as a shield this time. I calmly pointed out that he often used emotional displays like this to deflect accountability and turn the focus back on himself. That didn't go over well. My mom got up from the table, saying she couldn't handle the conflict anymore, and retreated to the kitchen. Justin slammed his fork down and stormed out, calling me selfish and accusing me of destroying Christmas on his way out the door. My dad, now left with just me at the table, dropped the tears and went straight to threats. He said if I didn't apologize and stop this disrespect, he'd cut me out of the will and the family altogether. I told him I didn't care about the money or the inheritance, I just wanted a relationship with him that wasn't built on guilt and control. That seemed to catch him off guard, but he didn't say anything else. He just sat there, glaring at me as I stood up and left the table. The drive home was quiet, but I wasn't regretting anything. For the first time, I'd stood my ground and called out the behavior I'd spent years trying to ignore. It was exhausting, sure, but there was a strange sense of relief too, like I'd finally taken the first step toward breaking free from the cycle. I didn't know what the fallout would look like yet, but I knew one thing, I wasn't going back to the way things were. Update 2. The fallout started almost immediately after the dinner. Justin blocked me on every social media platform that night, which didn't surprise me. He's always been quick to cut people off when things don't go his way. The next morning, my phone lit up with a string of messages from my dad. At first, they were concerned, asking if I'd calmed down and realized how much I'd hurt the family. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted. The messages became guilt-laden rants, accusing me of being ungrateful and selfish. He went on about how much he'd sacrificed for me, and how I was throwing the family dynamic into chaos. I didn't reply to those messages either. By the end of the week, my dad had expanded his campaign to extended family. I started getting calls from aunts, uncles, and even a couple of cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were neutral, just curious about what had happened. Others were more pointed, saying they'd heard I'd disrespected my dad in front of everyone and asking if I planned to apologize. A few, thankfully, offered support. One of my cousins told me she'd always thought my dad had a weird control thing and said she admired me for standing up to him. Justin, of course, poured gasoline on the fire. I heard through a mutual friend that he was telling anyone who'd listen that I was trying to tear the family apart because I couldn't handle being in second place. He painted himself as the reasonable sibling and me as the instigator. It was textbook Justin. My mom reached out a few days after the dinner. She sounded exhausted, saying she couldn't believe how far things had escalated. She apologized for not stepping in sooner during the argument, but then begged me to make amends. She kept repeating that my dad was under a lot of stress and that the family didn't need more conflict. I listened, but I didn't give her the reassurance she wanted. Instead, I told her I wasn't backing down on my boundaries. Thankfully, my friends were in my corner. When I told them what happened, they didn't hesitate to validate my feelings and remind me that I wasn't crazy for standing up for myself. A couple of them even shared similar stories about their own family dynamics, which made me feel less alone. One friend suggested I write out exactly what I wanted to say to my dad and Justin, not to send it but to clarify my thoughts. It turned out to be solid advice. In therapy, my therapist helped me process the dinner and strategize for what came next. She said I'd taken a huge step by confronting my dad but warned me that pushback was inevitable. She encouraged me to focus on maintaining my boundaries even if others tried to guilt me into compromising. The next major move came when my dad decided to escalate his smear campaign. He started calling more extended family members, spinning a dramatic tale about how I'd been brainwashed by my therapist and friends. He claimed I'd turned my back on the family for no reason and was lashing out at him without cause. I even heard that he was telling people I'd been corrupted by a toxic work culture in the city. The lengths he went to twist the story were impressive, if not absurd. One night, after another barrage of guilt-laden texts, I decided I'd had enough. I drafted a message to both my dad and Justin, clearly laying out my boundaries. I told them I wouldn't engage with any more guilt-tripping or manipulation, and that if they wanted to have a respectful conversation, I was open to it. Until then, I wouldn't be responding. I hit send and blocked both of them temporarily to give myself some space. The reaction was predictably over the top. My dad left a furious voicemail accusing me of cutting him off financially, which didn't make any sense since I've been financially independent for years. Justin, I assume, vented his frustration to anyone who'd listen, but I wasn't paying attention by then. My mom called again, still trying to play mediator. She couldn't understand why I wasn't willing to let this go for the sake of the family. I told her I loved her, but that I needed to prioritize my own mental health. She didn't seem to know how to respond. A few days later, I got a surprising message from a distant cousin. She told me she'd been keeping up with the drama and wanted to let me know I wasn't alone. She shared her own experiences with my dad's manipulative behavior, saying she'd always felt like he used his position as the family's patriarch to control everyone. Hearing that validated so much for me. It wasn't just me, this was a pattern. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became to hold my ground. This wasn't just about me anymore. My dad's behavior had hurt so many people in our family, and no one had ever called him out on it. I wasn't about to back down now, even if it meant more fallout in the short term. I deserved better, and for the first time in my life, I was starting to believe that. Update 3. A week after I sent my message outlining my boundaries, my dad upped the ante. I woke up to a flood of notifications, texts, emails, and screenshots from family members. My dad had gone full nuclear and posted a lengthy rant on Facebook, detailing how I'd abandoned the family. He wrote that I'd been brainwashed by selfish outsiders and accused me of trying to destroy the family unit with my entitled behavior. The post was as dramatic as it was infuriating. He painted himself as a hardworking, selfless father who had given his ungrateful son every opportunity in life, only to be betrayed. Of course, he left out the years of manipulation and guilt-tripping. To make matters worse, he tagged half the extended family. Within hours, the comment section became a battlefield. Some relatives took his side, calling me out for airing private family matters and saying I should respect my dad. Others weren't so quick to believe him. A few relatives privately messaged me, saying they'd always thought my dad's behavior was off and commending me for standing up to him. For a while, I debated whether to respond publicly. I didn't want to stoop to his level, but I also didn't want his version of events to go unchallenged. Eventually, I decided to reply directly under his post. I kept it short and factual, explaining that I had set boundaries to protect my mental health after years of manipulation. I even included screenshots of some of the guilt-tripping texts he'd sent me, just so everyone could see the pattern for themselves. The response was mixed. Some people supported me and thanked me for sharing the truth, but others accused me of being disrespectful and claimed I was dragging the family through the mud. Justin was one of the loudest voices against me. He didn't comment publicly but sent me a scathing email accusing me of being disloyal and deliberately sabotaging the family. He doubled down on the idea that I was ruining everything because I couldn't handle being the lesser sibling. Classic Justin. Behind the scenes, my mom quietly reached out. She admitted she was proud of me for standing my ground but begged me not to share any more private details online. She said the drama was taking a toll on her, and while she didn't defend my dad, she wasn't ready to stand up to him either. It was bittersweet hearing her acknowledge the truth but knowing she still felt trapped in the dynamic. Then things got even messier. My dad hinted in another post that he was considering legal action, claiming I'd defamed him and ruined his reputation. I wasn't about to let him intimidate me, so I consulted a lawyer to make sure I was covered. The lawyer assured me that my public reply, supported by evidence, didn't meet the criteria for defamation. Knowing I was in the clear was a relief, but it also showed me how far my dad was willing to go to maintain control. As the drama unfolded, more family members started to come forward with their own stories. A few cousins messaged me privately, saying they'd experienced similar behavior from my dad over the years but never felt they could speak up. One cousin even told me how my dad had manipulated her parents into co-signing a loan for Justin years ago, only for Justin to default on the payments. Hearing these stories made me realize that my dad's manipulative tendencies went deeper than I'd thought. In therapy, my therapist encouraged me to keep journaling everything that happened. Writing it all down helped me process the chaos without getting sucked into it. She also reminded me to focus on personal growth and not let the ongoing drama consume me. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from one of Justin's old friends. He told me he'd stopped hanging out with Justin a few years ago because Justin had a habit of bragging about being the golden child and getting away with things I never could. The friend said it always rubbed him the wrong way, but he didn't feel like he could say anything at the time. Hearing that validated a lot of what I'd felt growing up. Justin had always known he was untouchable in my dad's eyes, and he leaned into it. Right on cue, my dad played his next card. He suddenly claimed he wasn't feeling well and hinted that the stress I'd caused was affecting his health. He didn't provide any details, which wasn't surprising. This was a tactic he'd used before, pulling the sick card whenever he felt backed into a corner. I didn't engage. If he was genuinely unwell, I hoped he'd seek help, but I wasn't going to let him use his health as a bargaining chip. Meanwhile, my mom had her own turning point. After one of my dad's more dramatic outbursts, she told me she was exhausted from years of walking on eggshells around him. She admitted she'd been thinking about therapy herself. It was the first time I'd ever heard her talk about seeking help, and while I didn't want to push her, I hoped she'd follow through. As more family members started siding with me, Justin began to isolate himself. His usual allies weren't as eager to defend him, and his attempts to blame me for poisoning the family weren't sticking. I started reconnecting with cousins and relatives who had distanced themselves from the family drama over the years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had allies in my corner. The tide was turning, but I knew this wasn't over yet. My dad wasn't the type to back down quietly, and Justin wouldn't let go of his golden child status without a fight. Still, I was starting to see that standing up for myself wasn't just changing things for me, it was shaking the whole family dynamic. Update 4. After much hesitation, I decided to attend a family gathering. It was my cousin's birthday, and most of the extended family would be there. I knew it might turn into another showdown, but part of me wanted to see if bridges could be mended, or at least if things could stay civil for one evening. The event started quietly enough. I made small talk with relatives who had been supportive throughout the fallout, but it didn't take long for my dad to make his move. As soon as there was a lull in the conversation, he walked over, commanding the room's attention. He launched into a speech about how family is everything, and how it's devastating when one person decides to tear it apart. He never mentioned my name directly, but it was obvious who he was talking about. Then, in front of everyone, he turned to me and demanded an apology. He accused me of ruining his life, driving a wedge between family members, and tarnishing his reputation. His voice got louder with each sentence, and all eyes were suddenly on us. It felt like the entire room had gone silent. I stayed calm and told him I wasn't going to apologize. I reiterated the boundaries I'd set and explained that my decision wasn't about punishment, it was about protecting myself. He didn't take it well. His voice rose even higher as he accused me of being selfish and disrespectful. Finally, with dramatic flair, he stormed out of the room, declaring that his own family had turned against him. Everyone was stunned. For a moment, it felt like no one knew what to say. Then, out of nowhere, my aunt, one who had always stayed quiet during family conflicts, spoke up. She shared her own experience with my dad's manipulative tendencies, saying she'd always felt like he used guilt to get what he wanted. Her words seemed to break the tension in the room, and a few other relatives chimed in, sharing similar stories. Justin wasn't having it. He jumped into the conversation, accusing me of turning everyone against our dad. He claimed I'd been twisting the narrative and making things worse for attention, but his outburst didn't have the effect he wanted. Instead of rallying to his side, a few relatives started questioning his role in the drama. They pointed out how much he benefited from the family dynamics and how quick he was to blame others when things didn't go his way. Then, something I never expected happened. My mom spoke up. For the first time in my life, she openly acknowledged how controlling my dad had been. She admitted that she'd often felt trapped by his behavior but had stayed quiet to keep the peace. Her words were raw and emotional, and they seemed to shift the mood in the room. It was like a weight had been lifted, and for the first time, the family wasn't tiptoeing around the truth. My dad didn't come back to the party. My mom, a few supportive relatives, and I stayed late, talking about years of unspoken issues. We went over the patterns of manipulation and control that had shaped so much of our family dynamic. My mom seemed more reflective than I'd ever seen her, and I could tell she was starting to question her own role in enabling the behavior. Meanwhile, Justin wasn't giving up. Over the next few days, I heard through mutual friends that he'd started spreading rumors about me at work. He told people I was unstable and difficult to work with, clearly hoping to damage my reputation. Fortunately, it didn't stick. My colleagues knew me well enough to see through his attempts, but it was still frustrating to see how far he was willing to go. I didn't respond to Justin's antics. Instead, I focused on maintaining the progress I'd made. My therapist encouraged me to keep focusing on my own growth rather than getting sucked into the drama. Around this time, my mom reached out to let me know she'd decided to start individual therapy. She said she realized how much of her life had been spent managing my dad's outbursts, and that she wanted to work on breaking that cycle. Predictably, my dad didn't take the shift in dynamics well. A few days after the party, he called another relative to announce that he was officially disowning me, both publicly and privately. He claimed he was cutting me out of his will and removing me from all family matters. I didn't react, partly because I'd heard this threat before and partly because I didn't care. His money or approval had never been the point. What did surprise me was how many relatives started reaching out after the event. Some expressed regret for not standing up to my dad sooner. Others thanked me for having the courage to do what they hadn't been able to. A few even started distancing themselves from him entirely, refusing to buy into his usual manipulation tactics. As the dust settled, I began to feel a sense of empowerment. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to keep fighting for a place in a family dynamic that had been toxic for so long. I could rebuild on my own terms, with or without my dad and Justin. I started spending more time with the relatives who had been supportive and found comfort in the fact that I wasn't alone in this. The family dynamic was shifting, and while it wasn't perfect, it felt like progress. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back to the way things were. Update 5. The breaking point came a few weeks after the family gathering. My dad had been relentless with his texts and calls, alternating between guilt-tripping and anger. He'd leave long voicemails about how I was destroying the family, only to follow them up with texts claiming he was willing to forgive me if I apologized. Justin wasn't far behind, sending cryptic messages about how I needed to fix what I broke. It was exhausting, and I realized I couldn't keep engaging. That's when I decided to go completely no contact. I wrote a final message to both my dad and Justin, explaining my decision. I told them I wasn't doing this out of spite but to protect myself. I ended by saying I hoped we could one day reconcile under healthier circumstances, but for now I needed space. Then I blocked their numbers and all social media accounts. It was the clean break I needed. In the weeks that followed, things started to shift. My mom made the biggest move of all. She decided to separate from my dad. She told me she'd been reflecting a lot since the family gathering and realized how much of her life she'd spent walking on eggshells. For the first time, she seemed ready to prioritize her own happiness. She started therapy, and the change in her was almost immediate. She seemed lighter, freer, like a weight she'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. Of course, my dad didn't take the separation well. He tried to rally family members to convince my mom to stay, but his influence wasn't what it used to be. Relatives who once would have supported him were starting to see through his behavior. A few even told him outright that they weren't going to get involved. That only fueled his anger, and he tried one last-ditch effort to guilt me through mutual family members. But this time, no one took the bait. Justin, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated. Without my dad's usual unquestioning support, Justin's attempts to regain control fell flat. He tried reaching out to friends and extended family, spinning his usual narrative about how I was the problem, but fewer and fewer people were willing to listen. It seemed like his golden child status was finally crumbling. For me, cutting ties brought a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. I channeled my energy into my career and friendships, surrounding myself with people who respected my boundaries and genuinely cared about me. My mom and I started spending more time together, and our relationship grew stronger without the shadow of my dad's toxicity looming over us. We had long conversations about the past, and for the first time I felt like we were truly connecting as individuals. In therapy, my progress was undeniable. My therapist noted how much more confident I seemed and how I was finally prioritizing my own well-being. I also found comfort in online forums and support groups, connecting with others who had experienced similar family dynamics. Hearing their stories and sharing my own made me realize how common these patterns of manipulation were and how important it was to break the cycle. Meanwhile, the extended family dynamic continued to evolve. More relatives started holding my dad accountable, openly questioning his behavior in ways they never had before. It wasn't just about me anymore. His actions were being scrutinized on a larger scale. It felt like the entire family was slowly breaking free from his grip. Then came Justin's half-hearted attempt at reconciliation. He sent me a short message, claiming he wanted to move past the drama and be brothers again. But the tone was off. It wasn't an apology so much as a way to save face. I saw through it immediately and chose not to re-engage. I wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship with someone who couldn't take accountability for their actions. With the weight of the family drama lifted, I started thriving in other areas of my life. At work, I was able to focus more, and it showed. I earned a promotion and recognition for a project I'd been working on for months. It felt like a milestone, not just in my career, but in my journey to reclaim my life. To celebrate, I threw a small party with friends and a few supportive relatives. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a gathering to mark the progress I'd made. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy, surrounded by people who uplifted me rather than draining me. Around this time, I also started dating someone new. He respected my boundaries from the start, something I wasn't used to after years of relationships shaped by my dad's influence. It was refreshing, and while it was still early days, it felt like a step in the right direction. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time. Cutting ties with my dad and Justin wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It allowed me to build a healthier, more fulfilling life, one where I could define my own worth instead of chasing approval from people who refused to give it. I'm ending this chapter with gratitude for the support I've received, the lessons I've learned, and the hope that the future will be free from the toxic cycles of the past. To anyone reading this who's facing a similar situation, know that it's possible to break free. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Here's to moving forward.